Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanesh. I'm from the Center for Livable Cities, and I'll be your MC for today. The center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. For today's lecture, we have with us Ms. Eva Gladek from Metabolic to share her vision on circular cities and the circular economy. Eva Gladek is the founder and CEO of Metabolic, a leading consulting and venture building company that uses systems thinking to tackle critical sustainability challenges. She is trained as a molecular biologist and an industrial ecologist. And in her years of consulting work and concept development, Eva has advised over 300 companies and industry leaders. She's an expert in technical environmental management techniques and has developed leading frameworks for systems thinking and the circular economy. She's consistently listed as among the top influencers in sustainability in the Netherlands. And today she'll share with us some of our ideas. Before we start, I'll just go through the format and the format of today's lecture. So today's format for the lecture will start out with a presentation, of course, followed by a short Q&A session with the audience. The lecture will be moderated by Ms. Jessica Cham, Managing Editor, Eco-Business, and Adjunct Research Associate for the Center for Livable Cities. Kindly please hold all your questions till the end, till the Q&A starts. And with that, I think we can start the lecture, and Ms. Eva, please.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is actually quite an honor for me to be able to speak to all of you, and it's a great turnout. So I hope you're all enthusiastic to hear about the topic of circular cities. Before I get going with my lecture, I just wanted to get a sense of who I'm speaking to. So if you could all raise your hand in response to some of these questions, that would be great. Just to get a sense, who in here feels like they are already an expert on the circular economy, or at least knows a lot about the circular economy? Okay, it's a funny question. Anybody? Okay, at least a couple. That's great. And I think I know you all. Who here knows nothing about the circular economy? Raise your hand. Okay, there's quite some people. That's good. And I'm assuming that everyone else falls somewhere in between. Okay, now just to get a sense too of where you guys work, could you raise your hand if you work for the government? Okay, a lot of government, that's great. Could you raise your hand if you work in a technical discipline like science, engineering, or technology development? All right, quite some people. Could you raise your hand if you work in a social discipline or economics or, okay, so that's a bit vaguer, sorry. And does anyone here work for a startup? Okay, a few startups, that's good too. All right, so now I'm going to get on with my presentation. So I'm presenting 3 case studies today. First, I'm going to give you guys a general introduction, then explain a little bit my personal story of how I got involved in working in sustainability and the circular economy. And then I'm going to talk about what the circular economy is. So for those of you who said you don't know anything about it, you're in luck. Finally, I'm going to go through the bulk of my presentation, which is these 3 case studies. I'm going to talk about the circular economy work that we have done in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Charlotte, a city in the United States. And then some conclusions and some closing thoughts for Singapore. So first of all, Metabolic. I started Metabolic 6 years ago in Amsterdam. I had already been working for quite some years in the sector, in the sustainability sector, and I was getting very frustrated because I was doing a lot of advisory work and coming up with designs and concepts and then seeing very little get executed. There would be reports with great pictures and they would land on a desk and collect dust. And I wanted to create an action agency where if I had good ideas on sustainability, I could actually execute them and build them myself. So that's why I created Metabolic and built an amazing team of people around these ideas. who are sharing the same vision of creating a sustainable economy, which is the main mission of our organization. So we work in a few different ways. We have a consulting branch. Within the consulting branch, we are collecting information about how the world works, all of the sectors that we think need to be changed towards a sustainable model. And we're using that information to deliver insights to change makers. We work business to business, so we work with government a lot, and we work with high impact industries. And at the same time, understanding where we see leverage points for change. So small places in the system where you can change something that will have a big effect on the overall pattern of how things are working. So when we see something that is potentially highly impactful, we also set up our own projects and do our own experiments. So that's the kind of action agency part of it. And when those experiments are successful, we scale them up into ventures, into companies of their own. And we're building an ecosystem of these ventures, each focused on a specific part of the sustainability challenge. And in this way, we want to accelerate that transition. So we have a team of around 35 people, mostly based in Amsterdam and some in the Netherlands. This is just a snapshot of some of our team. And we are also now exploring how we can potentially work in Singapore as our base for work here in the region. So in terms of delivering insights, a lot of our work is very visual. What you see here is a Sankey diagram. Each line in this diagram represents, the thickness of the line represents the amount of material that's flowing through. And this actually shows the entire supply chain of a company called CNA, which is a clothing company based in the Netherlands. And they asked us, how can we become fully circular? So the first thing that we had to do was understand where they're not circular right now, and we mapped out their supply chain. So this is often the start of our process of delivering insights. All right, I don't know where to click. As I mentioned, we also do implementation work. So this is one of the experiments that we built. This is a pop-up smart grid. It's a container-sized unit that has a battery system inside and solar panels on the top, and uses hydraulic flaps to open in order to pivot towards the sun. And so it's called the solar transformer, and this became the basis for our company Spectral, which is doing turnkey smart grid solutions and also blockchain-based energy trading. And finally, with activation, so I will be talking about a project called the Ceuvel, which is something that we built in Amsterdam. But this is our demonstration site in Amsterdam, where we have a building where we collect urine, for example, turn it into fertilizer, and use it in a greenhouse to produce food, and demonstrate how you can close urban resource cycles. And this is one way that we hope to inspire people like developers or architects or policymakers to think differently about resource management in cities. So getting to my personal story of how I got involved in sustainability at all, because I'm sure those of you who are here who care about sustainability all have your own stories. I was actually, I'm the child of immigrants. My parents both came from Poland when they were adults, and they moved to New York City, where they met there. And they were very much in love with the idea of the American dream. They were coming from an environment where they couldn't do very much. They were economically constrained. And they believed that, you know, if you just study enough and work hard enough, that you can make anything happen. And they were also huge fans of technology. They really always bought the gadgets early, and were always doing all sorts of things of this sort. And my brother and I were both encouraged to study very hard and put into really good schools. And from a very early age, I was planning on becoming a scientist. I really liked research science, and they said that I was going to be the next Marie Curie. So when I was 13, I started working in laboratories. I was working in a pharmacology lab in New York Hospital. And one of the things that I did a lot in this laboratory was grow E. coli. This is a common thing that you do in labs. So what you see here on this side, this is a flask with just growth medium that's clear. There's nothing in there. And on this side, it's cloudy because all the cells have grown, and there's a lot of cells in there. And what I was really surprised about is when I would inoculate a flask, it would look for the first 23 and a half hours of its growth cycle like nothing was happening in there. And in the last half hour, because of the nature of exponential growth, the flask would go from being a quarter full to half full to completely full to all the cells dying. And this was like a visceral experience of how quickly and by surprise exponential growth can take you. So this curve is actually, it's going exponentially the entire way, but it only becomes, you only start to see the rapid rise when you're getting towards the end, towards the tipping point. And I didn't think so much about this. I went to the university to get my degree in genetics until I saw these graphs. This was at university, and I was required to take a class in environmental sciences. And these graphs all show the same kind of exponential growth pattern, except these are now describing parameters that are essential for life on Earth. And it's no longer about a flask with bacteria, it's about our own flask, which is our planet. So here you see drivers like population growth and GDP. Here you see consumption of resources like water, fertilizer, paper, motor vehicles. Here you have concentration of greenhouse gases, floods, and also changes in ecosystems, loss of ocean ecosystems, loss of biodiversity as a whole. And this was really terrifying to me because I knew from experience that positive feedback loops like this that result in these exponential growth curves can take you by surprise. So I looked into the whole system around this to see who is taking care of this. Is anyone in charge? And my answer was that not really. It wasn't being sufficiently dealt with by the people responsible for governing our economy or our society. And this is when I decided to change my career. I focused entirely, I finished my degree in genetics, but I went to get another degree in industrial ecology, which is the science of systems and understanding how human industrial systems can be optimized to avoid these types of impacts. So studying it further, of course, I don't need to tell this to everybody in here, but there are many issues that are both underlying those exponential growth curves as well as the result of those exponential growth curves. Everything from massive energy use, droughts, pollution from mining, poaching, hunger, and one of the root causes of all of this is overconsumption. This is Black Friday in the United States, where people fall over each other and trample each other to go shopping. Oops. And as a scientist, from my scientific background, I also really wanted to understand if we are on this exponential growth curve for all these different parameters, where is that tipping point? Are we far down the line, or are we getting close to a certain tipping point? And fortunately, I wasn't the only one asking that question. A group of scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Center developed this framework called the Planetary Boundaries, which actually defines 9 key Earth systems that have to be kept in a stable range in order to keep the planet livable for humans, not even necessarily for other living beings, just for us. And this area in the middle, this is the safe zone. This is the zone of uncertainty, and this is the zone where we have definitely crossed the zone of uncertainty into high risk. So we talk a lot about climate change, which you see over here, but as we all know, it's still in the zone of uncertainty. There's a chance that we can reverse certain effects, and we haven't yet crossed the 2-degree change level. But for biodiversity loss, we have lost 58% of biodiversity in the last 40 years. And this is actually putting us in a critical risk situation. So with exponential expansion, we have around 20 years to figure out how to prevent the total decimation of biodiversity loss. So for us, this is a very important compass, a tool to understand when we have different sustainability impacts, how we decide which ones to focus on and which ones to prioritize avoiding. But it is not all bad. There are actually, even though this may seem like a very heavy piece of information, knowledge is power. And the fact that we understand that this is a result of a certain system that we have built gives us the keys to the solution. So first of all, if we have exponential problems that we have created, we can also create exponential solutions. And this is very important. We need to be searching for these exponential solutions. This shows actually the growth in global renewable energy consumption. And I remember 10 years ago, I was looking at a report from BP projecting the growth in solar uptake. And they predicted a very minor increase. And what we saw that last year, the United States, a country that is not even that ahead on these topics, is 40 years ahead of schedule for the adoption of renewable energy and solar installations in particular. In 2015, over half of the new power installed was renewable, and in 2017 already, there were some weeks when renewables hit 25% of global power supply, which is very impressive. So there are ways that we can trigger these types of cascades and result in solutions, but we have to be systematic, and we have to take the right approach and look from the high level and translate down to the lower level. One of the frameworks that we at Metabolic think is extremely important for understanding how to focus and where to put our attention is actually the circular economy. Over the last 6 years, we've done around 350 projects with Metabolic, and over half of them have been in the area of the circular economy. And so I'm going to explain now what this is and how it relates to this whole planetary boundaries concept. So, the linear economy is often presented in contrast to the circular economy. This is most of what we have right now. We extract resources from the environment, we make them into products, and we dispose of those resources. Along each part of these steps, we're investing a huge amount of energy, time, money into those products that we're making, and then they disappear. And we lose a huge amount of value. We lose the embodied time and energy and effort and knowledge that is in those products when we throw them out. A circular economy is when you actually figure out to be better at reverse logistics, basically. So this is that pathway from extraction down to disposal. And these are technical resources, so man-made goods like plastics and metals, etc. And these are biological resources, so plants, organic materials. And for each of these, you have a different cycle of returning those into valuable use. So you can maintain, you can reuse, remanufacture, finally recycle. And the smaller the circle, the better, because the more inherent value you're maintaining. And a similar thing is true for biological resources. One of the interesting things, and one of the reasons that the circular economy has become so popular, especially in Europe, is that this represents a huge pathway for saving a lot of money. So McKinsey calculated that in Europe alone, you could save up to $630 billion US dollars per year if you took a circular economy approach. And that is because all of that value is not getting destroyed, it's getting retained and cycled through the system. And for that reason, the circular economy is often framed as being very different from sustainability and focusing on business models and economics. So we see that it actually can create a lot of jobs. The more complex the use that you apply to a product, for example, if you reuse rather than recycle, you can create many more jobs per ton of material or per that you are disposing. There are many circular business models that people focus on. And this also here, this graph shows the different amounts of value that you can get from reusing a whole product versus reusing its components or just the material itself. So the circular economy is not about recycling. It's about creating extended, infinite cycles of value, just like a natural system, where you go into a forest and everything is being retained at high value through that entire system. But it's not all about materials, and it's not all about money, and that's something that's very important to remember. This is where the connection back to the planetary boundaries comes in. This is a picture of e-waste in China, and a child sitting in a big pile. This child's parents probably sit over an open fire trying to extract copper and other metals from this e-waste every day. In this process, they're getting sick, and they're causing the environment to be damaged. They are getting the material back though. So, very circular in theory. Except we would never say that this is a circular solution, because you can't take one problem, which is materials and resource management, and solve it in a way that creates a new problem, which is health damage and environmental damage. As a result, through all the projects that we've been doing on the circular economy, we've refined a definition and a system for evaluating circularity. We have the 7 pillars of the circular economy. We start with materials and making sure that they're being maintained at the highest level of value, but then we make sure that energy is based on renewable sources, that water is properly maintained, that biodiversity is supported, that human culture and society are preserved, health and well-being are preserved, and that we're using resources in a way that generates multiple forms of value, not just money, but also aesthetics and enjoyment. And this is all within a system that has to be resilient, fair, and transparent. So that is an important part of the circular model. So where do we start? If our world is currently not circular and we want to make it circular, how do we understand where to intervene? Because Metabolic is a systems consulting firm and we are very scientific and systematic in the way we approach things, we decided that we were going to do a project of our own to map out the entire material flow of the planet and understand where we should intervene and focus. Because if you only have 30 people, you need to focus. So we looked at all the main material streams. So here we have biomass, fossil fuels, metals, minerals, and water. Water is on a logarithmic scale. It would be off the page if it was correct. And then we looked at where all of these are going and where they're coming from. So you can see here the dominance of Asia as a whole. The majority of the materials in the world are being processed and extracted here. This is for the year 2010. And then this little line here at the end, this is what is recycled. And this is not even to scale, because if we made the line appropriately small, we couldn't see it. So this is how linear the economy currently is. We also then took this and tried to match each of these resource flow streams to the planetary boundary transgressions that we talked about. So actually, even though biomass is only 20% of the total material extraction, roughly, it's actually related to over 80% of the planetary boundary transgressions, like nitrogen cycles or phosphorus cycles that are getting transgressed, or biodiversity loss. So it's also very important to make sure that we're doing things in the correct way as we transition to a bio-based or renewable economy, which we need to do, but we need to do it smartly. And so based on this list and this analysis, we developed a list of the key intervention areas for achieving a circular economy. And for us, the top one was agriculture and food. And the second one was cities and the built environment. And that's the one I'm going to focus on today, or I am focusing on. So cities, for us, are really important leverage points. They only occupy around 3% of the land area of our planet, but they consume 75% of global resources. And they're responsible altogether for 60 to 80% of greenhouse gases. So if you imagine this, you change the way that cities are structured and their metabolism, how they work, and you can address a huge percentage of the total problem that we're facing. You can actually bend those exponential growth curves in the correct direction and start to reverse some of these changes that we've been causing. So this is just a statement about, if you take this holistic picture of the circular economy, we need to design cities that are regenerative and waste-free. We need to take a circular approach that saves resources, creates jobs, engages people, and creates inclusive environments. And so for us, this has been a big focus of a lot of the work that we've been doing at Metabolic. So, the first case study, Amsterdam. Now this is an important part of our history as Metabolic. When I started the company 6 years ago, we didn't have any resources, we had no investment. We were working out of my living room in Amsterdam, and we really wanted to do something around circular cities. We wanted to show that cities can be done differently, and we thought, well, what about a showcase? Why don't we take our office and turn it into an example of circular models? And so I was introduced to some architects who were working on a circular economy project, and they didn't really know much about the circular economy. So I thought, okay, well, we'll talk to them. So this is Amsterdam. This is where the station is, the central station. And this is North Amsterdam, which is not very common for tourists to visit. But if you go, I recommend you go there, because that's where a lot of the change is happening in the city. Around 1 kilometer from the free ferry, there's this plot of land, which was a polluted plot of land that used to be a shipyard where boats were built. And this was made available by the city to the people for a competition. They said, who has a good idea for using this plot of land for 10 years? It has to be super sustainable and circular. And we won the competition. We won the competition with this concept, which is the Ceuvel. So this is an artist's render of what the site was supposed to look like in theory. It doesn't quite look like this, but it actually is quite a cool place. And the photo on the poster where you see from the top, it's taken by a drone. It's actually of the site once it's been constructed. So the concept behind the project, well, so this is the background. So the land was polluted. It's around 1/2 hectare. It was a temporary project, so 10 years only. So the business case was very difficult because we had to figure out how to make the investment and get all of that value back in 10 years. And we had a total budget of €500,000, which is very little because we had to realize 1,000 square meters of office space and make it super circular and sustainable. The main concept was to take old houseboats. So in Amsterdam, many people live on boats, and a lot of those boats get thrown away because the value of the water plot is actually much higher than the value of the boats themselves, so people throw them out. And we salvaged those, and we eco-retrofitted them, and we put them on the land. So we had instant buildings because we recycled whole buildings that were going to be thrown away. And an important part of the whole plan was to, of course, make it circular. So we looked at all the resource flows on the site, everything from kitchen waste to water to human waste, and figured out how we could process it through different systems on the site, like a Symbiote reactor, a water upgrading system, wastewater treatment, composting of different types, and also biodigestion. So there's a lot of things going on, and we produce food on the site as well. This is a picture of us retrofitting one of the buildings. We actually had to remove the roofs and raise them to create better insulation opportunities and more lighting. Okay, I think I'm in this shadow or something. Or I'm blocking someone's view, sorry. And this is actually the first boat that we got. We bought it for €1 because it was going to be thrown away. And this is what it looked like after we converted it. So it looks a little like Noah's Ark. And this was the pilot boat. We called it that because it was the first boat, and we really learned a lot about what not to do because we insulated it from the outside, which made it a lot more expensive. So we had a whole team with Metabolic of engineers who had never really done these practical projects because they had all been students and they never really had to build these things. And so this is Vard, one of our lead engineers, and we gave him the assignment. He had to figure out how to cut a boat in half in 24 hours, and he had to get through a slab of huge concrete and the engine block. And so we had a crane waiting to move part of the boat, and this was his challenge. So we had all of these kinds of things happen during the project, and people really changed and learned. And you know, from the start of the project to the end, you wouldn't recognize these people, the amount of confidence they had and what they learned that they could do. We built all of the technologies with the people of the project who were going to be renting the boats. So this is us building wastewater treatment systems with all the renters. And we also designed our own sensor and monitoring technology. So these are Arduino boards with their own enclosures that would monitor the water, air quality, etc. And so this is actually the day that the boats were finally craned onto the land. A very exciting day. Another thing that's quite important is, as I mentioned, the land is polluted. So we use plants to phytoremediate the soil. So actually specialized chemical removing plants for the soil. So this is Metabolic Lab, the thing that was supposed to be our office when we started the project. On top is the greenhouse. This is the micro-biorefinery. The biogas, the biodigester is over here. This is actually processing human waste. In here, this is urine being turned into struvite in a struvite reactor, and then on top, these are the plants getting planted in the greenhouse. And this is what the Ceuvel looks like today. It's a hippie village, for sure. Everything has been made out of reused materials, and it's a continuous site of experimentation and exploration, where we are running experiments all the time. And it's become a hugely popular site. We host delegations from around the world all the time. And I was very surprised because I was like, okay, this is a small little project, but people are inspired and they're getting something out of it. And I think the reason is because it's actually there, because we actually built something. And as I mentioned, the experiments are continuing. Just a few months ago, our spin-off Spectral launched the Juliet, which is this blockchain-based energy token. So for each of the buildings, when it generates power that it doesn't consume, this gets converted into something called a Juliet, a token, that they can then trade for beer or other things on the site. But so, of course, the Ceuvel was a small thing. It was an intervention that was meant to inspire people, to show people that you don't need billions of euros to make sustainable housing or sustainable offices possible. But really what you want to do is you want to create change at scale. You need to change entire cities. And very interestingly, for us, the Ceuvel started that process of creating that change because we were asked by the city to come up with a strategy for all of a big neighborhood in Amsterdam. And we said, this is great, we want to do this very systematically. So we developed a process for urban transformation, and actually for transformation in general, where we start with a current state analysis, so really understanding your current resource flows, then setting a vision and goals, and then developing interventions, so strategies that you can use to move towards a circular model. And so this is Rotterdam. The Ceuvel is actually located right here, so it's in this area, and it was a very heavily industrially polluted area for many years. And the city has asked us to develop a whole circular economy strategy for this bigger zone, after the Ceuvel, of course. So we modeled all of the resource flows, the energy and emissions, the water, the other resources, and we did it at 2 time points, so current state and the future. We worked with stakeholders, around 400 stakeholders, to develop a vision and goals with really measurable KPIs. And with that in hand, we were able to get a manifesto signed by many of the important stakeholders of the city. All of them agreeing, yes, we want to build in a circular way. We are going to make this into an experimental test zone. And that was very important because you also need people to have the right to experiment and to actually invest more in these areas without worrying that there will be repercussions or rules that they are breaking. And as a result of that, we have started working on many more advanced projects. So this is, for example, Schoonschip. It's a community of 47 households. It's floating households, and it's going to be one of the most sustainable communities in Europe, certainly. And this is located within Rotterdam. So we took those principles of the area development and translated them to these individual houses. For instructions, we gave instructions to the architects, etc. And more importantly, this has started also to scale to the level of policy. With all the work that we've been doing on individual buildings, the city of Amsterdam also asked us to develop a new code of basically the rules for tenders for developers who want to build. They have to prove that their buildings will be circular. So they are scored against our circular evaluation tool, which we developed, and this is now being piloted. So this is really where it starts to scale, because it's not just about one building or one little neighborhood, it's about actually creating the rule base for all these new developments. So that's what's going on in Amsterdam, our home base, where we have a lot of connection with especially the northern part of the city. And my second case is about Rotterdam, which is quite different. Rotterdam has a very different character. You can already see it was bombed in World War II, so there's very little old center left, and that means that there's this spirit of let's just do stuff and a lot of ability to build new things, and it has a different character from Amsterdam. And actually there were already many circular economy projects going on in the city. But Rotterdam came to us and said, well, we want to develop a systematic strategy for the circular economy because we know we're doing a lot, but we want to map it and we want to understand what's going on so that we can accelerate it. And so again, we applied our mapping method that I already explained. So we started with the overview of all the resource flows in Rotterdam, except we did not include the port, which is important. And then we actually zoomed in based on this impact analysis on 4 sectors. So this impact analysis, it shows actually the embodied impact of the different resource flows. For each bubble, the size of the bubble represents the total CO2 emissions associated with that resource flow. And on this side, we have embodied land use, so how much land was needed to produce that resource, and here we have water. And here you can see, this is meat, and this is dairy. These are huge, and it's really surprising to see how huge they are compared to something like gas or electricity. And they far outpace everything. Even this is, for example, concrete. And there's a lot of construction going on in Rotterdam, but this allowed us also to zoom in on certain important areas. So this is actually the map that we made that zooms in on agri-food in Rotterdam. And we looked at all the different resource flows here. Rotterdam is not doing so badly on circularity. This is all valuable reuse. This is organic waste, so manure. And here we have compost, biogas, and this is incineration. Incineration we actually consider to be a low value use though, because there's so much more chemical and productive value that you can get out of organic materials than just by burning it. And so this was one of the big potential areas, as well as this, to see how we could recircularize that. And of course, this is CO2 emissions. CO2 is also a very linear output. We need to be closing that cycle as well. So we took a very structured approach. For each of those resource flows, we actually quantified the total amount in tons, and we developed interventions, and we looked at studies from other cities for what was really effective at reducing certain impacts, reducing some of those resource flows. We tried to minimize waste, first of all, and then figure out ways to reuse some of those valuable flows. And so from this, we were able to create a really structured plan. As an example, for example, reducing food waste is a big topic and it should be everywhere. We found that in Rotterdam, 30% of the food is wasted by consumers because they don't understand the packaging labels on food. So the food is really, it's very confusing. You sometimes get two types of labels, like best before and packaged on. And you have these things kind of together, and best before actually doesn't mean that it's expired when it's that date. It doesn't even mean that it's bad, it's just that it's probably best before that date. And so people don't understand this, and they are, they're afraid for their safety, so they throw out this food even though it's perfectly good. So there's ideas for changing these labels and making them more clear, and even making color changing labels so that you actually have a good understanding of when the food actually has to be thrown away. And so this is one thing that could save 30% of food waste in developed countries where this is mostly happening at consumers' homes. So with this structured approach, this is wasted food, this is organic waste, and this is manure. And we figured out how, with these different interventions, so each one of these blue dots is an intervention, you could actually reduce the amount of waste massively by over 50%. And then these are different solutions where you could upgrade the value of that waste at the end of life. So beyond actually just dealing with these resources, there's important new R&D that has to happen for cities to really become circular. Right now, most of our agriculture is monoculture. It's huge fields of the same crop or plant. And imagine you're a bug that likes wheat. Well, if you see this, you're just gonna have a big party and destroy this entire crop. And the only way to deal with it is to use a lot of chemicals and control these, which then have an effect on ecosystems, et cetera. But if you actually design in symbiotic agriculture, or what we call symbioculture, then you can exchange different resources. So here we have mushrooms that are producing CO2 for plants, and we have fish that are producing nutrients for the plants, and you can actually create an entire cycle. And you can actually upcycle certain valuable resources to include in these systems. So this is a Dutch company called Protix that is using black soldier flies. So these insects that really have a huge appetite and eat 2 times or 3 times their body weight every day. You can take really low quality organic waste, like for example, municipal waste from a city, feed it to these black soldier flies, and the larvae of the flies can be used as animal feed directly for fish or chickens, or they can be turned into products like lipid paste or protein paste that can be used in food production as well, or even in cosmetics. So you can actually close these cycles and design these symbiotic integrated systems. So it's more than just thinking, how do we close and fix all the resource cycles? It's how do we create new integrated solutions. And so one of the things that I worked on a couple of years ago is designing a system, a symbiotic agricultural system for inside of a greenhouse. And this is a model for a 1 hectare greenhouse where you see different types of plants, fish, mushrooms, chickens, all in one system, exchanging all of these resources to become fully circular. And this was kind of a concept of what it could look like, where you have hydroponic channels above and you have different mushroom units and you grow trees, etc. So of course this is very like fanciful. It wouldn't exactly look like this, but it's the idea. And also, you can imagine that as a farmer, now you have to produce one crop and you get really crushed on the price. But actually with an integrated system like this, you have many different crops and you can actually sell those directly from your greenhouse in an urban supermarket, for example. So, the last case, and I've been told now that I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to have to go through it quickly, is the case of Charlotte. Charlotte is a completely different situation. In the Netherlands, the cities are quite advanced. They, you know, even if they're doing incineration, which is not fully circular, they are still not throwing much into landfill. But in Charlotte, 100% of the waste that is not part of the very small stream that is recycled is going into landfill. So the gains are automatically quite huge. There are lots of good things about Charlotte. It's a very fast-growing city. It's a center of manufacturing and also of banking in the United States. It's very popular right now. It's the #1 choice for millennials, which they're very proud of. But there's also a lot of challenges with the city. The prosperity is not accessible to everyone, and this is one of the biggest problems. They have a lot of poverty, and if you are born into poverty in Charlotte, you have less than a 5% chance of getting out of poverty in your lifetime. So they were very terrified when they heard this statistic, and they asked us to develop a circular economy strategy that would fix their resource management problem while also creating jobs and prosperity and social mobility. So we set up a vision, an integrated vision for Charlotte based on these 4 pillars. So zero waste city, innovative city of the future, resilient and healthy city, and city with opportunities for all. That's that social mobility pillar. And for each one of these, we defined indicators. And this shows a KPI that we calculated comparing Charlotte's performance to another. We recommend that all cities develop these types of integrated indicators that allow them to also track their progress and their baseline. So this shows the material flows for Charlotte, very different than the ones for Rotterdam and Amsterdam. So you can see this is what's going to landfill versus recycling. And also, by the way, this is actually a sneak preview because the Charlotte study is being officially released publicly next week. So you guys are getting the world premiere of our work with Charlotte. So here, this is another bubble diagram, but this time what we focused on is job creation potential. So for each of these bubbles, it shows the total number of jobs, and you can see here plastics, for example, are massively leading in the total number of jobs that could be produced if these were recycled. And a summary about plastics here, this is what's currently landfilled, and if you recycled this, even just basic recycling, you could save this much oil, create this much revenue, and this many jobs. So it's really a huge gain in value. We developed 5 business cases because we wanted to zoom in on really specific parts of this resource flow. We looked at textiles, food waste going into feed, a materials innovation lab, and tokenized reverse logistics for plastics, and finally, concrete recycling. I'm gonna go through these quite quickly, but you are going to be able to read through them in detail in the report. If you would like to see that, it's in English and it's going to be downloadable from our website next week. And actually, we calculated in quite some detail what the value and the cost of setting up these reverse logistics chains would be and how you could really develop this result. So with textiles, we focused on taking textiles from consistent sources, like hotels or uniforms, because then you get the same quality of material. And the idea was to start this way, so that you can build the infrastructure. So the profits for this initially are quite small, like $200,000 a year. However, this can grow massively once you have the infrastructure established. The next is, I've already shown this case. This is the black soldier flies. They have a big aquaculture industry in Charlotte, and so we calculated the possibility of turning that food waste in Charlotte into black soldier fly larvae, and the potential profits per year from this case are 1.2 million. The return on investment was very fast, and so this is a very appealing, interesting case. The Materials Innovation Lab was less about a specific material flow and more about understanding how to stimulate innovation in a city. So we actually told them you should create a facility where you have students, engineers, and young entrepreneurs working on how to take specific material fractions and turning them into products. So for example, take orange peels and turn them into a new biopolymer. There are lots of interesting innovations going on in biomaterials right now that can really massively increase the value of those waste streams from what they are currently. The tokenized reverse logistics system was one of my favorites. The idea is that you have a reverse vending machine. And if I'm a company and I want PET bottles, I can put out a call for PET bottles, and then customers can go to the machine and put them in where they're scanned, and they get tokens in exchange. And those tokens can be exchanged for discounts or other types of credits or benefits. So it's not really like a complementary currency, but it can actually go in that direction over time. And finally, the concrete recycling chain. Charlotte is demolishing and building a huge amount of buildings. So this was a very logical thing to look at. And the other thing is that they have glass, a lot of glass bottles, that they cannot recycle. Well, they can recycle them, but there's no economic value. So you can put that glass into concrete and also reduce the CO2 emissions associated with that. So the overview. In total, the 5 business cases that we looked at only covered up to 15% of the total material going to landfill. But it would create an estimated up to 500 jobs, reduce CO2 emissions by 380,000 tons a year, improve the KPIs that we defined, and create 22 to 34 million US dollars in revenue per year. The other thing is that it would lower the unemployment rate from an estimated 3.8% to down to 2.2%, which is great. There aren't that many unemployed people. They are mostly just underemployed. So, my last slide. You can see that there are these different cities at different stages of development. Some of them are really scaling up, like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, though even those cities have different characters. Amsterdam is really much more of a museum where they have to deal with a huge legacy. Whereas Rotterdam has a lot more space and a port that they can interact with and use for scaling. And have cities like Charlotte that have a lot of ambition. They want to be the first circular city in the United States, but they have a really long way to go. And I'm really happy to see that they are ambitious and they want to take this seriously. And then the last thing is, I wanted to ask you all, what do you think about Singapore? Because I think Singapore has huge opportunities to really take a lead in the circular economy. There are not that many cities in Asia that are really doing this. There's a lot of conversation, and there's really great individual projects. But to take it from a comprehensive, holistic perspective, I think there's a huge opportunity here. And I hope that I get to actually talk about that in the Q&A session, which is about to start. So thank you all, and yeah, I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Chiam. I'm Managing Editor of EcoBusiness. We are Asia Pacific's only publication dedicated to reporting on sustainable development. And myself, I've been reporting on sustainability issues for more than a decade and also on circular economy. And Eva, thank you for such a fascinating presentation. I felt like I learned so much, going through all your examples and all these technical concepts as well as aspirational concepts. So, just to start off the conversation, I think, the conversation on circular economy in Singapore is very nascent. I remember that 2 years ago, we hosted the first circular economy roundtable in Singapore. And one government official came to me and said, I had to Google what circular economy meant. And that was really interesting, but ever since then, there has been so much conversation. Our environment minister has said that we are looking very specifically on how we're going to apply circular economy to our waste management sector. And CRC has been doing some work as well to look at circular cities. So I'd like to just pick your brains. You've been in Singapore for a few days now. I know that's probably a very short time, but where do you think are the low-hanging fruits for us to really adopt some of the aggressive circular economy principles that you've shown us here?
Well, I don't know whether I am qualified yet to say where the low-hanging fruit is. What I would say is that it's really, to identify that, it's really important to start with this baseline scan to understand what are the resource flows and which ones are really causing the biggest losses of value, et cetera. But I have seen certain things that seem to be real opportunities. And of course, one of them is that you have this centralized management of construction, for example, to a large part through housing construction. And I know from actually when I was at Yale University doing my master's in industrial ecology, one of the things that I was asked to do at some point was a study on Singapore's construction and demolition waste, because there was concern about the landfill running out of space, and the C&D waste was one of the main types of waste flows that was still ending up in the landfill. And I think with this kind of circular building approach, where you design buildings for deconstruction and reuse, you can really close the cycle on building materials, reduce pressure on the landfill, create a lot more value, and really pioneer certain technologies around buildings. And that's partly possible because you have this more centralized system around construction. So that's one case, for instance.
You know, I think that's really interesting because in Singapore, we have a very high industrial recycling rate. So I think for construction, it's something like 80%, and it pulls up the entire nation's recycling rate, which is actually really low. It's, for household recycling, it's at 20 to 30%. 6% of our plastics gets recycled. And so when you think about, apart from demolition waste, which is very regulated, how do you go about looking at commercial buildings, for example, or housing, and getting those waste streams to be more efficient in reusing and recycling? This is something that we really struggle with.
Yeah, so this is funny because most countries report very high, or most developed countries report very high rates of recycling for construction and demolition waste. Actually, this week I heard even higher numbers in Singapore, something like 99%, or I don't know. But the point is that a lot of it is not actually recycled. It's what we would call downcycling, because it's crushed into a mixed material and used as backfill most of the time. And I mean, of course, I would need to verify exactly what's going on here. And that's not the optimal value recapture from this material. The best way that you can get real value from building materials is to use them as whole components. So it's that same principle. Preserving complexity allows you to get the biggest value out of it. So you have to start by designing circular buildings so that you can easily remove certain materials, and when you have certain systems that you need to upgrade, they're easily accessible and then can be removed, and also a lot of data management. So in the Netherlands, a big discussion is around material passports. So it's basically you treat your building like it's a resource bank, and you make sure you know everything about where different materials are stored in that building, so that you actually have a kind of digital interface for that. So there's these types of things that I think could be very easily implemented here if people chose to do that.
Okay, thank you. You know, there was one part of your presentation that I thought was really interesting, and that's when you touched on incinerators. And I'm going to be slightly controversial here because incinerators in Singapore, it's a huge thing. We're now building our 5th incinerator, and in the Circular Economy Roundtable that we hosted, the same one 2 years ago, we had the Netherlands ambassador there, and the Dutch are so aggressive on circular economy principles. They have a 70-page manifesto, and they're really doing some great things. But somebody in the roundtable actually said it is cheaper for somebody to just incinerate, like throw it away into our incinerators, than to actually recycle or reuse anything in Singapore. And because we are so constrained with land, our incinerators are seen as like a foolproof solution to waste. And you said in your presentation there's so much chemical and minerals in incineration waste streams before it actually gets incinerated. So for a country like Singapore that depends so heavily on incinerators, how do you go about changing that mindset within policymakers as well as the public, that that's not actually the panacea?
Yeah, this is a really challenging topic, of course, but you can't deny the fact that from this principle of preserving complexity, you are destroying a lot of value when you incinerate something. And there are certain material classes that are actually very challenging to get back. So one of the things that we've been doing recently at Metabolic is we started doing an analysis of all the different metals that are required for the energy transition. And we know that there are different technologies that are coming up, like solar, wind, et cetera, and they all require different amounts of certain metals. And we calculated that actually we don't have enough to make that transition happen. There are certain things that are just scarce. Same with phosphorus. It is now mined in a very few places in the world, and it's essential for agriculture. And we are just neutralizing it and getting rid of it instead of recovering it. So if you imagine that we have a lot of this material, so there's there's plenty of this in what gets incinerated, and you're not recovering it properly, eventually we are just going to have a shortage. Now, I think that one position that you could take as Singapore is to become a strategic resource base for the entire region. If you start to accumulate and collect these materials out of the waste streams, you can actually become holders of certain resources and then become a kind of regional broker. And this is a very strategic plan for for a nation to take in this position, because you then start to accumulate various resources and secure them for future generations. It's true that it requires more investment now. It is cheaper to burn things. We are not designing products for circular chains. We're not designing them for disassembly, etc. We have to start putting pressure on the designers of products to make different products. And that's going to take some time. But in the meantime, this has to be a coordinated effort where we start recovering what we can, putting pressure on redesign of certain products and materials, and then shifting away from incineration over time. And that is, I think, the plan.
Fantastic. Is there anyone from NEA here in the audience? Oh, even if you are, I'm sure you're not going to raise your hand. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm not going to hog the limelight, but I'm just going to ask one last question and I'll open it to the audience, which is that you're here in Asia. So your examples here have been very much, in Europe and the US. So do you have any existing case studies or work ongoing in Asia where it can be applied? And in what cases have you seen differences, applying the circular economy principles in Western cultures and then into Eastern cultures?
Yeah, so we have a really nice global network of alumni. We really like bringing interns from around the world. And one of our former interns at Metabolic is now the CEO of TCEN, which is the Taiwanese Circular Economy Network. And we have been visiting Taiwan and doing several smaller things in Taiwan. And right now we're working on a vision for a circular textile sector for Taiwan, which for Taiwan is a very important industry that they're planning on further developing. And it's been, we are going to release this study in the next 2 months or so. In addition to that, we have done work for the city of Beijing. We did a freight analysis, which is also available on our website. You can download the results. And we were looking at how to optimize freight and what the current situation was, why certain problems were arising, and also linking this to the air quality situation in Beijing. And it's been very culturally different, of course, working here, and not just between the Netherlands and Asia, but also between the two countries. I think one of the things that we found is in some cases it's harder to get data or harder to know whether the data is reliable. But I also think that there's some great power in having some more centralized decision-making and processes, where once you have a solution, then it's much easier to get it implemented and get it moving forward in many cases. So there's a lot of differences, of course, but there's also quite a lot of benefits.
Do you see very high potential areas or cities in Asia specifically that can quite quickly adopt circular economy principles?
Well, I think Singapore, actually, and that's one of the reasons that we're here. So my colleague Harold lives here, and he's now exploring whether we can establish a base with Metabolic in Singapore. And this is still an open question. We're trying to see whether there's interest and who we can collaborate with and what kind of people we can hire. But I think that this country and city, partly because it's a country and city in one, and it has so much developed infrastructure and also financial capacity. What I was also saying is that many cities in the West are very poor, and they don't have the resources that they need to invest in necessary actions. So even when they come up with plans and strategies, they cannot follow through. And so I think that that's really important. And I also think that it's great that there's a base of incubators and innovation spaces that are developing here. I really enjoyed visiting Citizen Farm earlier this week. It's a nice initiative as well. So
yeah, they're very well-known social enterprise here. Thank you. So I'd like to open the floor to questions from our guests here this afternoon. I'm sure many of you have burning questions for Eva. Any one of you would like to start off our Q&A session? There's a gentleman over there. If we can get a microphone. Yeah. Could you identify yourself and organization?
I'm Lorenzo from Lab. I've been actually to the Ceuvel last September, October. It was fantastic. And we are now trying to organize we've done an urban design festival this year in Singapore, and we are looking into these kind of themes for the next year. And I just would like to ask what kind of skills do you have in your teams to go through this fantastic analysis?
Thanks. Yeah, so we have quite a lot of different skill sets within the team. But I would say on some level, we are an applied industrial ecology firm. So there's quite some people on our team who have studied industrial ecology. This is a degree that is not actually that common, but there is a program in Singapore, and there's a program in Sweden, in the Netherlands, and the United States. So it's like a very specific thing. We have a lot of business-minded people. We have software developers. We have data scientists. We have designers. So it is quite a range. We have some people who specialize in policy. Lately, we have a lot of people who do GIS, like geographic information systems, because we're doing more and more spatial analysis. So it is quite a range, but almost everyone has a passion for sustainability. And I think it's more important, even more than skills, sometimes you need the right drive and the culture to learn this kind of thing. So.
Thank you very much. Is the next question? Don't be shy, guys. I'm sure you have many questions for Eva. That was absolutely, interesting.
You can ask me anything about like the financial models, about anything that you think is.
Okay, there's a gentleman in the middle. Can we get the microphone to him? Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Henry Speeds from ICN Landscape Company. My question is about how long it may take for this whole idea to take total root all the way across the world, because it's all wonderful, and ever since I was a student, we've been talking about these kind of things, but finding it difficult to get them to actually happen. And even from your rather advanced level, it seems to be quite difficult to get it upscaled to the big scale. Is it really feasible right across the board?
I think that's a great question. And it's true, you can see that, so the environmental movement, broadly speaking, started in the 1970s. And that's when things were at a really critical level. Our industrial production system started to have really visible effects. Like in the United States, there were rivers on fire and this kind of thing. And that resulted in this whole wave of regulations and management. And it's been kind of these waves of interest in environmental issues and green tech, and then those would die off and then start up again. So there's been several of these green waves. But there's something that's changing in this latest round, because the problems are becoming persistent and actually not going away, and the sort of longer term threats are becoming more apparent, and there is a kind of consciousness shift that is occurring among people, and I think that that's really important. People have to become aware of these issues and their importance. And so what you've seen, what I've seen, which is really interesting in the last few years, veganism and vegetarianism have really, for the first time ever, seen a significant increase in uptake. And this has never happened before. Even though people have been talking about it, it's not increased all that rapidly, except for the last 2-3 years. And I think that this is something that we just have to observe. Metabolic started 6 years ago. A lot of these projects that I've been talking about are really recent. And I have been personally amazed by the fact that we put everything into building this small showcase, the Ceuvel, and that had this domino effect. And that domino effect happened very quickly. We have had, on average each year, we have something like 50 international delegations visiting the Ceuvel from all around the world, because they want to learn from how the circular economy principles and how to scale them up and replicate them. And I think that that's actually been very rapid. I can't predict the future, no one can, but I have the feeling that this trend is actually here to stay, and that it is accelerating. And with this exponential change model, the idea is that it has to accelerate exponentially. And the only way that it can do that is if we have more like-minded people collaborating and jointly building towards these efforts. And hopefully it will look differently than when you were a student as well. So.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'd like to just add on to that question, and that is, you showed us the 7 pillars of the circular economy earlier, and when we talk about how quickly this movement is going to spread and how many cities will adopt it, how do you define what's a successful circular city? If you were to go around the world and rank the cities, are there certain things that you look for that says, okay, this city can call themselves a circular city?
Yeah, so I mean, actually, we've been asked by several cities to develop KPI frameworks or monitoring frameworks for circularity. And there are always metrics like total virgin resource use per unit of output and efficiency of recycling, et cetera. These are quite important. We also have more sophisticated indicators like scarce materials that are getting fully recovered or this kind of thing. So those are at the basis. But what I said with the 7 pillars and with these points around avoiding creating new problems when you solve one problem, it's really essential not to just look at those material indicators in a vacuum, but also consider how they're affecting all the other ones. So an ideally circular city would be doing really well on materials metrics, on renewable energy metrics, on carbon emissions, on biodiversity impacts, not just in its own walls, but also upstream and downstream. So you have a complete holistic performance, and of course on human well-being and on social indicators, because these things are very much correlated. So one of the things that we've wanted to do for a long time, but we cannot get we haven't gotten the funding to do this, is to actually create an international circular cities index using our framework, and then actually to be able to rank the cities against one another. But that is also more like a hobby pet project.
We can work with you on that, and we can help you publish it here.
That would be great.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, we have 2. We'll take both before we come back to you. First the gentleman in blue, and then the gentleman behind him.
Oh, hi, thanks for the lecture. It's Tony from CPG. Because your principles around circular economy and sustainability transcends quite a few numerous sectors. So I assume was there a change in mindset for the proponents for those cities you mentioned in terms of policy changes, integration of different departments? Because I'm sure it involves environment department, public utilities, planning, for example. Was there a mindset change and policy change by those cities?
Okay, maybe you can answer it first,
Yeah.
and we'll go to the next question.
Yeah, so actually one of the things that we've encountered in many cities is that there's a silo problem. So different departments are really separated. You have like a group that's working on energy, one that's working on certain utilities and water, et cetera. And the circular economy is a cross-cutting issue. You can also, for example, if you are looking at heat networks and yet you have a lot of heat in your gray water system in your wastewater, those should ideally be coupled and dealt with together rather than in a silo. And I think what's been going on in a lot of the cities that we've been working with is that they've been creating new positions that are cross-cutting. So most of the cities have created the position of a chief circularity officer or person that is then working across the different silos. And I think that that's really a trend that we've been seeing in many, also with resilience. There's cities that have a resilience officer, so there's these new positions. One of the issues that you see too is that they then have too many cross-cutting positions of people who are competing for status, like a resilience officer and a sustainability officer and now a circularity officer, so you kind of want to put them in one role. And there are definitely policy changes that are happening, but again, this is a really new field. The Rotterdam strategy was just released in March, and there's a lot of changes that are still happening. So it's also, things need to be explored.
Thank you. And the gentleman behind?
Good afternoon. I'm a researcher from NUS. My name is Pradeep. And my question is regarding this. So this relates to one of the questions you asked in the beginning. How many of you are social entrepreneurs or social organizations, right? So usually this approach, what I've shown here, follows a top-down approach. Like you go to lawmakers, or you go to the people who are control the city or control law, and then it's a top-down approach. It percolates from top to bottom. They make rules, regulations, and then it's followed. What is your take if this is supposed to be reversed down? I mean, if it's supposed to be a bottom-up approach, will this work? Is it going to work with that case? Because most of the social entrepreneurs, they work in bottom-up approach instead of top-down approach. They first go to the people. They're the first access point. So if this has to be scaled to a social version, where we don't involve, or let's say we try to do it in a bottom-up approach, how meaningful it would be? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I wouldn't say that this is all a top-down approach. The thing that's been going on in the Netherlands in particular, and also what we've tried to copy in Charlotte, is a unique combination approach, which is top-down and bottom-up. And that's actually what I recommend. The top-down, what you want from your government, you want a strong vision. You want an integrated plan. You want something that actually, there should be resources, like funding, that are supporting the right kind of innovation. So you need that bit of top-down support. But actually most of what's going on in these cities, especially in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, is bottom-up activity. So there's already huge groups of entrepreneurs that are doing experiments. So I didn't really get into this because there wasn't enough time, but in Rotterdam you have this incubator called Blue City, which is an old tropical pool building that's been retrofitted by a bunch of individual people who have banded together to turn it into a circular economy incubator space. And there was a company that was growing mushrooms on coffee grounds, and there's companies that are doing little experiments with plastics recycling and upcycling organic waste into leather and these kinds of things. So there's all of this bottom-up activity. And I think the interplay between the two is really essential. You need to stimulate your bottom-up community. You need to have all this source of ideas, and a lot of it will not be very scalable. It will just, not all of it will work. And then you need the top-down to provide the framing, the vision, and also the channels through which you can scale that. So that's that important collaboration.
Thank you. Okay, there's a question here from the gentleman there, and one here as well. We'll take both. But this gentleman first.
My name is Jameson, and I was a project manager for many years. You are suggesting some sort of consultancy, which I have for the last half an hour trying to pin down. Can you make it more simple by creating a service agreement? That means you're a consultant. And where do you fit in when a developer wants to develop a fairly large project, say 1 hectares, comprising a few blocks? He normally has the budget for consultancy fees, which includes an architect, a quantity surveyor, a landscape consultant, maybe a curtain wall consultant. And where do you fit in? Do you have a service agreement? Then I know what your profession is. And then from then on, we move forward. But I don't know whether you're going to work for government, going to work for CLC, or you're going to work for the Land Transport Authority, or for the recycling people. How do I hire you? Make it simple. Produce your service agreement, then I consider. And will you be in the way of the architect, arguing with the architect, working in consultation with the architect, or contesting the architect, or as an appendix to the architect's efforts, and you don't get into the architect's way because he can kill you, right?
Well,
time is of the essence to a developer. And if you have all these highbrow ideas, very sophisticatedly expressed, but how do I implement it?
Well, I can tell you. Thank you.
Thank you. Because I don't know what your profession is.
Yeah, well.
And it's not in the title.
Well, actually.
If you develop a profession like a geophysical consultant, how deep to pile into the earth to sustain your structure?
I think
or
you're
a landscape consultant, then I know what you're doing.
I think you're an emerging profession,
because there are many owners
economy consultant
who have the money, but they don't know how,
to describe you.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yeah, no, so I can imagine why you think it's confusing, because it's true, we do a lot of things, and it's because we are looking at systems and combining what used to be single professions into what we do. But we actually have very specific ways in which we work with clients. So within our consulting team, we have 3 departments. One of them is our cities department where we work with city governments and we develop strategic plans, we do spatial analysis, we work on policy, we work on this high level thing with cities, and we do these circular city strategies, and that's what we do with our cities department. Then we have our green building department, and in our green building department we work with developers and we work with architects, and they actually in the Netherlands do have budgets for us. We are called a sustainability consultant, and that's what we do. We are hired along in the very beginning part of the phase, of the development phase, to help develop a sustainable concept where we understand the different issues that are going on in the world, and we translate that to the building idea. And we actually create constraints for the architects. So they don't kill us, they like working with us. We tell them, okay, you must design within these parameters, and then we work together. And they come up with designs, we look at them, we say, okay, this is good, but you have to change this. And this is how we work with the architects. And so developers are actually one of our big clients. Then we work with corporates. So our third business division is our high impact industries division, and there we are hired by the strategy, innovation, and sustainability teams of large companies who want to make sure that their products are more sustainable and that they are not having a bad impact on the world, and so they hire us to develop these things. Aside from that, we really care about the world as a whole, so we do a lot of our own research. You can see we did our own research about the metals or about the global material flow. So that is actually from our think tank. So Metabolic Institute is where we do all of these our own research projects so that we can do a better job for our clients.
Thank you very much, Eva. There was another question from gentleman here in the middle, in the black shirt. Can we get a microphone to him? Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask you about the economic profitability of the project. I'm François Vienne, urban planner from CPG Consultant in Singapore. And I'm very curious about this example in Amsterdam. Very simple question. What are the components to make it profitable so that the $500,000 you got an extra value at the end and at the same time produce this circular economy? Thank you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so the project was and is profitable. What we were actually quite constrained because it's a social project and it's this top-down, bottom-up collaboration where we were a bottom-up team of architects and us as Metabolic, and we actually had a cap on the rent that we could charge. So we were told you can only charge maximum X amount of rent because this is supposed to be a place for creatives and for sustainability companies. So that even made the business case harder. We were able to build the project by using a lot of upcycled materials. So a lot of the materials that you see, the boats themselves, and a lot of the building materials like the windows, etc., we harvested from the environment, which actually reduced the fees, but it made the design process quite complicated because we had to design around what we were finding, and that's actually a very strange, not normal way of building. And once the whole site was in operation, it has a few different businesses. There's the cafe on the site, which is a restaurant cafe. That's a private business, and they pay rent to the community. There's our building, which we use as an event space as well, and we host workshops. And there's a hotel with floating houses on the water. And these provide kind of the anchor for the value that's generated in the whole site. So we collect rent from the different parties. We also got money for R&D to do various experiments. So it's a very mixed business model. So it's rent, R&D, space rental, and all these different events. Because the site has become so popular, we host lots of tours. And we also host festivals, for example. So there's many different ways in which this whole site makes money and is profitable on its own. And not to mention, it also increased the real estate value of the entire area around it by threefold, which is, for the city, one of the goals, or is partly responsible for that.
That is an amazing achievement, I would say. We've just got 5 minutes left, so can I ask you any last questions? Gentleman on the left here, and we'll take both questions and come back to you. We'll take 3 questions and come back to you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Huan Xinjie from URA, Urban Redevelopment Authority. So I have a 3-part question. Sorry. Okay, so the first thing would be that I heard that you say that circular economy is very applicable to Singapore, which I think is very heartening. But the I mean, unless I'm mistaken, I'm of the impression that we have a bit of a lack of natural resources. So, for example, water we buy, sand we buy, we don't have much wind, perhaps the only thing we have is the sun. So, in your opinion, does this pose a challenge to us in terms of a circular economy? And second thing is land is scarce. So does your study actually review where should we put our land resources to in order to play a better part in this circular economy? And the third one is that systems have a certain life, right? So once you put in a system, you know 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So how do we start to plan and change the previous systems, like how we generate electricity, in order to reach the end goal of having circular economy? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm going to let you answer that before we take any
Yeah,
more.
I think I'll forget it otherwise. Okay, thank you. Yes, so I do think that the resource constraints in Singapore present an interesting challenge, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any resources. Like I said, with this metals issue, even though you don't have mines here, you have products that are coming in, so you can actually extract those and keep those resources here. So that's one way that you can accumulate resources. Also, even though you don't have fresh water, you have a lot of water around you, and you know, it depends on your goals. Like if you want to really be self-sufficient for whatever reason, if that's a strategic goal, then of course you can always make the investments in the technology that are necessary to make that happen. And that's also one of the questions that would be addressed if you're looking at land allocation. What are you prioritizing? Are you prioritizing food security, or are you prioritizing production of certain products or materials? And this would be something that you have to do in a process like I described, where you first do this baseline assessment, and maybe you already have a lot of these pieces of data, and then secondly have this integrated set of goals that define that strategy. And the second part of your question was about investment in technological lock-in. And this is a really big problem around the world. One of the things that you see, though, is that smaller technologies, investment in things that are less cost per unit, like windmills or solar panels or these kinds of things, the pace of innovation goes a lot faster because the lock-in is lower. So you can actually, one way to do that is to actually consciously choose to invest in less expensive long-term technologies to have that faster innovation rate and prevent the lock-in. And secondly, to design contracts where you can really step down from certain investments. Like if you already have something that you need to keep for the next 30 years, that's fine. But then make a plan for how you actually, by the time let's say it's an incinerator, make sure that by the time 30 years has gone by, you have actually figured out a way to deal with all the different resources, and you phase things out over time in a profitable way. So this is one of the strategies that has to be developed. Not always easy, but can be done.
Just a small note here that Singapore also generates one of the highest amount of e-waste in Asian cities, and I think if we just think about how much e-waste how much electronic products we import, and how much that is incinerated or just shipped away, I think that's a huge potential there. Mm-hmm. So we have 2 more questions, and I think we'll wrap up. I think a gentleman here, and then Lashrin at the front.
Hi, my name is Maurice Lam. I have a specific question for you with regard to the black soldier fly converting vegetable waste into fish meal. Mm-hmm. What's the economics of that business, and how scalable is it, in the sense that we are currently looking at going into such a project? Thank you.
Yeah, great. The economics of this project, of this type of work, are really good. Actually, it was the best case that we looked at in Charlotte, and it's also very scalable. The Charlotte report has a case study in it. The company that we got the information from, at least in general terms, because they wouldn't give us all the details, is a friend of mine who runs Protix, which is it's a company that has pioneered this approach, and special breeders in the Netherlands. And they are, I think, very interested in setting up plants around the world. But there's also, of course, a lot of different research on this topic going on. We've done our own experiments with black soldier flies, and they really do eat everything. So as long as you figure out how to get them to grow in the right place and keep them from escaping, which is also important, you can actually really create a huge pipeline of high quality output from this system.
I can actually attest to that, because in Singapore there's already some companies using black soldier flies, and at the recent expo I actually brought home some of these for my kids, And the worms kind of like just wormed out of everything, and then we couldn't find them in the garden afterwards. So I think we needed to have a little bit more of a controlled environment for it to work. But that actually, the black soldier fly technology is actually already being used in Singapore, and I think Temasek Ecosperity Foundation has granted one of the local companies here to do it. So I think that's already something that's in Singapore. Okay, and the final question for this afternoon, Lastrina. Can we have a microphone to the lady at the front? Here? Yeah, thank you.
Hi Eva, thanks for your presentation. I'm just taking a step back and looking at the broader timeline, but that by 2050, over 2/3 of the global population will be living in cities. What would you say would be the most needed action we need to take to ensure that everyone can become or turn into circular cities? And on that note, how would you convince cities that this is not only beneficial for their economy, but also it's something very urgent that we need to do, taking into account all these climate impacts that's happening all over the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like the apex question. So the thing is, we need to make these transformations because we are going to be facing certain resource constraints. And also, one of the things about moving towards a circular model is that it can make life much more pleasant and enjoyable. So imagine a circular city where you have all of your wastes that are getting collected and reprocessed into valuable materials as much as possible within the city itself. You're producing as much food as you can in the city and in peri-urban areas. You have gotten rid of vehicles, so the air quality is much better. It's less stressful because you have great garden walkways and you have automated electric transport for all of your mobility needs. All the buildings are designed for disassembly and recovery, so you're putting less pressure on mining and on actually hinterland needs for transport. You've dramatically reduced the need for shipping in that sense and created new, smaller logistics cycles which need a different kind of management. So this is kind of you can go on and on describing what this looks like, but it's the kind of environment that we should want to live in, where we integrate nature into the built environment, create more health, create more well-being, create more time and space, take advantage of automation and the different technologies that are emerging. And I think there's no reason why anyone should look at that kind of vision and say, well, no, we actually want to be living in polluted, messy, and wasteful environments. So I think it's just about making that vision really clear and building these business cases step by step so we can all collectively move there.
Thank you very much. You know, I think that you really hit the nail on the head, and the circular economy and its principles just make so much common sense. And while I was sitting through your presentation, the one phrase that came to mind was the economist phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." And I think we should repurpose that and say, "It's the circular economy, stupid." And on that note, I hope all of you have learned something from our sessions here in whatever jobs that you're doing, in whatever roles. I hope you can take that knowledge away and, you know, perhaps advocate and act on the circular economy here in Singapore in some way. So please join me to thank Eva for a most enlightening presentation and question and answer session. Thank you very much.